Welcome everyone, good evening. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Amy Weishart, I'm the director here at the library. We're really thrilled to welcome Blue Butterfield for a talk about her beautiful new book, Maine, a Love Story. Before we begin, I just want to thank our generous donors for their support. We're a nonprofit, community-supported library, and our donors really make all of this possible. I'm really pleased to welcome you here tonight. So Blue Butterfield is a woodblock printmaker who grew up in Bar Harbor, and she found her footing on the trails of Acadia. She has works in permanent collections around New England, including Maine Medical Center, Maine General, and the New England Cancer Center. She illustrated Coloring Maine and Robert Tristram Coffin's Christmas in Maine. She issues a yearly calendar of woodcuts, which, if you haven't seen, are completely gorgeous. It's called A Year in Maine. It's currently in its 18th year of publication. And her new illustrated memoir, which she'll talk about tonight, is Maine, a Love Story. It was published last year, and we also have copies available for sale that I'm sure she'll be happy to sign. So welcome, Blue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight, and thank you so much to the library for having me here. And for all of you for sharing a precious summer night. I really appreciate it. So I always give these talks talking about artistic process, because it's what I'm most interested in, which is how an idea comes to fruition, how it goes from just a thought about it to an actual solid thing that you can see and touch. But I want to do that tonight in the framework of something I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is how I approach indecision or uncertainty. Because as I've gotten older, I've thought about it a lot more. I tend to be a planner, someone who wants to be decisive and think about, what I'm going to do right away. And, life isn't like that. And I think being able to approach it in the current conditions and make decisions in the current conditions of what you're trying to buy are really important, both as an artist and actually as a provider. So I actually want to share a short true story. Next slide. This is not a medical talk. You're in the right room. But I'm also a hospital medicine physician assistant at Maine Medical Center. And this is just, I want to present to you the case of the organic farmer. So this is a 23-year-old young man who works at an organic farm, was found down. He was watering some plants and was found having seizures. And he was brought to the emergency department. He had seizures the entire way there, 20 minutes. He was in kidney failure by the time he got to the emergency department, requiring many, many medications to finally evade the seizures. And other than the kidney failure, there was really nothing abnormal about his scans or lab work otherwise. He was admitted to the hospital for a presumed diagnosis of viral meningitis. I inherited him the next day on my list of rounding. And when I went to see him, he could give me no history whatsoever. He was still completely asleep. But his parents were there. And they told me that, so his dad told me that 45 minutes before this happened, he was eating a blueberry muffin and drinking coffee with him. And he was completely fine. He had no headaches, no neck pain, nothing. So that sort of set some alarm bells ringing of like, this doesn't sound like a meningitis. This doesn't sound like a virus. So I spoke with the infectious disease doctor to make sure we were on the right antibiotics and antivirals, but I also started thinking about, like, it almost sounded like a poisoning. I called the farm manager, who said, no, there's no pesticides, no solvents, nothing on this property. This is an organic farm. And then I called the toxicologist, and she was intrigued, and she came talk to the patient, who by that point was a little bit awake and able to give a semi-history. But he absolutely denied any drugs, no medical history whatsoever, no history of seizures, and nothing unusual about that day. And I met her in the hallway after, and she said, I just don't know. I agree, there's something really odd about this story. And we both thought about it a lot more. And then the next day, so this is now day 2, she went back in the room, and he was a little bit more awake. And she said, are you sure? No mushrooms, no, nothing. And at that moment, as he was denying this, his roommate walked in. And his roommate said, oh, hey, remember that valerian root tea you made yesterday? And he said, oh, yeah, that's right. I was on the Androscoggin the day before this happened, and I foraged some valerian root, and I made some tea out of it. And the very astute toxicologist said, oh, valerian root is a lookalike for, anyone know what that is? Yes, water hemlock, the most toxic plant in North America. So, which I didn't know any of this, but I was fascinated. He made a complete recovery, kidneys recovered, he was fine. I was in a state of distress for 2 days because 2 days to diagnosis was like a day and 22 hours longer than I was comfortable not having one. So, but it's a case and ones like it that I think about a lot, because when I approach a patient, certainly there are ones who come in and say, they have a cough and a fever and abnormal chest X-ray, and you say, okay, they have pneumonia. But what if they don't? You know, and there's lots of other options, and I think having that moment of uncertainty, of delaying your certitude, is really important in medicine, and I think it's important in a lot of things. And it's fun, as a funny aside, as I was talking about my decreasing confidence in immediate diagnosis with my patients at the hospital, my son, who's in this like terrible field of data analytics in college, said, oh, this sounds just like the Dunning-Kruger effect. So next slide. And which I had never heard of, but is a real thing. I thought this was really interesting. So when you know the least is when you're the most confident about that information. And then as you learn more, your confidence goes way down. And even when you become an expert, it rises, but it never comes back to that final level. So, and you know, very apropos to our current internet society. So that was fun. Next slide. So, a little aside, but I wanted to talk about that as a sort of a stepping off point of uncertainty and how I want to approach everything I do, including like making decisions. Again, not everything at the beginning, but as I go along. And so I'm going to just start with my evolution as a printmaker. At Bowdoin College, I had the unbelievably good fortune of being taught by Tom Killian, who was a visiting, actually, history professor, but he was also a wonderful landscape woodblock printmaker in the traditional Japanese style, which means one block for every color. I think this piece is, I think, at least 7 blocks, and then he puts them all together, prints them all on the same piece of paper so that, you know, lines them all, registers them all. And I love the idea of this, but it's a lot of carving, you know, many, many blocks for one piece. But he taught me all about wood carving. Next slide, please. These are Japanese stainless tools from McLean's, which is a printmaking supplier out of Portland, Oregon. V gouges, U gouges, and next slide. And I carve with, out of Japanese plywood from the linden tree called Shina. And this is just an illustration to show you, so I think when a little bit of a misconception about woodblock printmaking is that when people hear, you know, you're carving away wood, they're almost thinking you're sculpting it, and that's not really the case. There's really 2 planes on the block. There's the plane that is being printed, that's going to pick up the ink, and I'll show you why that works that way in just a moment. And then there's what you're carving away, which is not going to pick up ink. So you're carving negative space, you're carving around objects. Next slide. And the reason for this is because the way ink gets on the plate is with a rubber brayer. It's a very hard rubber cylinder, and the ink gets rolled to an extremely thin layer and then rolled on the plate, and everything that wasn't carved picks up the ink. Next slide. So here's just an illustration of one of my blocks where you can see that everything tan is the wood that's carved away. And this is actually, this is a multicolor block that we're going to get to in just a moment, but just so you can see that the blue from that brayer just picks up everything that was not carved. Next slide. And the block is transferred onto the paper with an etching bed press. And it's a hand crank, it just rolls right through underneath, and then the ink transfers from the wood onto the paper. Next slide. So for years, before I had access to a press, I was just making black and white wood blocks and printing them with the back of a wooden spoon, which is kitchen counter printmaking at its finest, and then hand coloring them. So this is, again, and most of these pictures, I'm just going to forewarn you, are just pictures I took of prints in my studio. They're not scans, so they're not, the lighting sometimes is a little off, but this just gives you a sense. This is just a black and white print. Next slide. Then I had a great fortune of running into Don Borvet, who is a reduction woodblock printmaker out of the North Shore, and he gave a week-long intensive at Hartwood College in Kennebunk about reduction printmaking, which I had never heard of before. I'd always wanted to carve with color, to do multicolor prints, but the whole idea of one block to one color, it just sounded like way too much carving and like was not good for my frugal Mainer brain. But he was teaching Picasso's method, next slide, which was developed in the 1950s. This is a piece of Picasso's. He did it with linoleum, and it was one block, one piece of paper, or multiple in addition, but all the colors come from one block. So you start with the lightest and brightest, you print that, and then you carve away whatever you want to stay that color, and then print the next color right on top of it. And then again, and then again. And so that till you've basically destroyed the plate and just left the darkest color there. Next slide. So this is just to show you, now obviously if you're gonna pass a plate and a piece of paper through a press 20 times, it's gotta line up. So this is showing, this is a key block, this sort of L bracket with these Turns Burton clips on top, and that is to clip on the paper so that it lines on the same spot every time. Next slide. So I'm just going to take you through a few of these just to show you what different colors look like as sort of in the process and how you go along. I always love the idea of like flip books. It can be fun, I thought at some point, to just make a flip book of all these, because I like people to try and guess where they are too. So carved away the white of the paper first, and then I printed the whole block with this pale blue. Next slide. Okay, then said, what do I want to stay that pale blue? Carved it away and printed a pale green on top. So everything looks a little dreamy right now, but one of the things I really love about this style of printmaking is that there's so many decisions, and you can't possibly think about them all, at the very beginning. You'll drive yourself mad. So you have to really be in the moment. And to me, again, it's that indecision of just, I'm not going to make a decision about two colors from now. I'm going to slow this down, and I'm just going to think and pivot on this one moment and the current conditions of it. So again, next slide. And you can see that with as each color is added and more is carved away, it kind of slowly comes into focus. Next slide. That green, and next slide. And next slide. All right, so that is Door Mountain, when it froze, it's sort of more. Just want to talk for a moment about drawing. Next slide. So I always use Vine charcoal, and again, I think it really is because things get so solidified in my mind if something's too permanent on the paper. So Vine charcoal is great because you can erase it in a second and just start over again and just keep reworking that drawing until you kind of have things placed where you want. Now, if something's going to pass through a press with the paper on top of the block, when you open it, you're going to have a mirror image, right? Everything's going to be in reverse. So if you want the final product to look like the drawing, you've got to reverse the drawing. So on the right, this is actually the plate. This is the woodblock plate with the drawing on top of it. And what I do is I take my drawing, when I kind of have it about where I want it, and I bring it to Kinko's and I use the mirror image, very high tech here, and just get a Xerox copy. And then I take that mirror image and carbon copy paper it onto the block. And this also gives me a chance to draw it again, and in reverse, where suddenly this perspective, mistakes in, foreshortening, those really pop when things are in reverse. There's something about that just happens when you, and that's why, it's funny, I think some early studio art professor would have been saying like, well, use a mirror, draw it and see what things look like. It really does work. And then I draw it a final time in a permanent marker, just a thin permanent marker, just so that I can find my way as I layer color. So, next slide. So this is this Southport Island piece, which we're just gonna run through now quickly, was actually a 2-block reduction, because sometimes you wanna have really warm colors next to really cool colors. And when you put those on top of each other, it gets really muddy sometimes. So this is a way to, I actually learned this from Jim Lee at Mass Art, a way to have warm and cool colors side by side and not competing, layering them on top of each other. So next slide. This is a little pale, but you can see that pale blue starting, and next. So you can see some really warm oranges, really cool blues. Next slide, and next. So, by the time you get to those, when you're in early, sometimes things look a little, they're not really connected yet. And it takes those final darker colors to just sort of pull everything together. Next slide. And next. I think that one's it. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, next slide. Yeah. And this is just to show you how much colors change as you add different ones on top of them. And that's part of, again, that pivot process where you have to, because suddenly you have a color that you didn't expect to have. And then you have to decide, okay, where do I want to stay? Where on this piece do I want it to stay that color? And then I'm going to carve that away. Next slide. So this is Sergeant Drive. And then next slide. So you can see like how much things change. And there are many colors in this piece, but that was just a 3-part, just to kind of show you how different the blue looks depending on what's on top of it. And then next slide, and I'm just going to take you through just a couple more of these quickly, just because they each have a little bit different technique. And next slide, and next. So I want to preserve that blue of the creek, but I did not want such a strong blue to muddy the waters of the rest of the plate. This is a 1-block reduction. So I actually used some white and just just rolled white all over the remaining piece to really try and hold that blue back. And this is kind of another technique when you're really transitioning color. Next slide. So now we're moving into pale green. And I've got this thing lately where sometimes I like to allow the Sharpie, you can use spray fixative to kind of like hold it back where it won't come through, but sometimes I like a little of the Sharpie coming through on the plate. Next slide. And it usually gets mostly covered up by the end anyway, but I think it's kind of interesting. And so you can see warmer tones now, transition next, and I almost stopped here. I think my mom was like, I think you should stop there. but then, of course, I had to keep going and see where this was going to land. Next slide. So then turning into purples, and next, next, and final. One more slide. There we go. So that is a snowy egret on Northeast Creek. Next slide. So again, tell me if you can guess where we're at here, but this is a different technique of mixing the darkest color for the top and then a transparent medium. So these are oil-based inks, but you can almost imagine them to be, this is almost like water for watercolors. Like you're just trying, without adding white, which is just gonna really cool a color, you're trying to just tone down the color. So I take basically a piece of plexiglass, the color I want on one side, and just a transparent medium on the other, and then I just roll that sprayer back and forth until I have a gradient. So this is just a gradient of that color. Next slide. And again, everything carved away that I want to stay those colors. I did a bit of selective rolling for this. Next slide, you'll see what I'm talking about. So I was like, I think I'll just try and pick up some greens, and it makes it look pretty disjointed, but again, knowing that things are gonna come back together at the end. Next slide. And next. So those darkest colors are going to really make what seems incredibly bright recede into the background. Melanacolite. And just one more of, again, this sort of selective rolling. Next slide. So really wanted really bright yellow birches in the fall. Next slide. And then some pink granite. One of my sons is really into rock climbing and has been coming up for it. Next slide. Next slide. And again, you can see this is kind of getting this disjointed look where I'm selectively rolling pieces. Next slide. But again, I couldn't have put those blues on top of that orange and, you know, had the blue I want. Next slide. Next. Next. And next. Okay, so that's south wall of Champlain. And I think I have one more of these. Oh, I did just want to show you quickly. So I still do black and whites occasionally. This is just a drawing of Amphitheater Bridge. It was actually for the book. I made it for the book. Next slide. This is the black and white. Next slide. The color. Okay, color version. And then finally, we'll just one really quickly. I know I've gotten deep in here. Next slide. So splitting at the horizon. This is another way to like have really different colors in the same piece and have them not competing on top of each other. So again, that horizon trick on the top, and then this yellow on the bottom. Next slide. And then I decided that yellow, once I saw it, I was like, I wonder if that yellow could be the reflection in the water. And then one of those, all right, I'm going to change how I was going to do this piece. Next slide. And then the same thing happened here. I was looking at this blue. I was like, I wonder if that could be the shadow of the snow on the rocks. Next slide. Next slide. And then some gray for, got those front rocks a little grayer. Next. There, so some buffleheads on along the Ocean View Drive. And lots of things don't work out, but, but sometimes they work out, you know, but it's part of the process. So I was enjoying being a printmaker. 2020 rolled around, and my hospital job suddenly got really unfun. And I am a very, you know, I'm an optimist at heart, and yet I found myself in a moment of despair. You know, I had 2 children who hated high school all of a sudden. They loved it, now they hated it. They hated being home, they were depressed, work was awful, and I couldn't, you know, I just couldn't imagine, like, it was all these losses, was this it? You know, is that what life was about just losing sort of one thing after another as you get older? And I found myself with this is 2021 now, it's like a year into it, and I found myself with this stack of like magazine articles that I had loved over the years and saved. And one of them that had really spoken to me from, I think it was 2017, 2018, was Catherine Schultz's When Things Go Missing in New Yorker. And it's a fantastic article. I highly encourage you to read it, but it's basically about a year of loss, starting with her car keys and ending with her father's death. But the revelation in it is that the joy of found things, and that is what life is all about, because we all lose things, but it's about what you find that gives life meaning. And this, the next slide, this is just a quote from it. The smitten lovers who marvel every day at the miracle of having met each other are right. It is the finding that is astonishing. You meet a stranger passing through your town and know within days you will marry her. You lose your job at 55 and shock yourself by finding a new calling 10 years later. You have a thought and find the words. You face a crisis and find your courage. And that, especially again at that moment, really spoke to me. So I called a writer friend and said, I literally said, I want to find the words. I have wanted to write for a long time. I don't know what I want to write, but I want to write. She said, okay, you need to talk to Susan Conley. She lives in your neighborhood and in Portland, and she is a wonderful, like, nationally recognized memoirist and novelist who also does editorial work and leads writing groups. So I called her, and I said, okay, I'm gonna send you 2 essays every month, because I like assignments. And she said, sure, what are you gonna write about? And I was like, well, I'm gonna write a travelogue about, at least Maine, maybe New England, and like all the different places. I'm gonna illustrate it with woodcuts. And she said, okay, this sounds interesting, bring it on. So I started to write consistently, just getting into the practice of it, on all my days off. And it's really was a wonderful exercise that I hadn't even, I guess I'd always dreamed of a life of letters, but never really thought about what it would be like to, because it's a lonely business, writing by yourself. But the generosity of my family just blew me away. My sons and husband almost every day said, what are you writing? Will you read it out loud? Like what? And I mean, who does that? When I first started, my husband, who's very kind, but also very honest, said, it sounds really clinical. Like, okay, well, I've been writing H&Ps for the last 25 years, so what do you expect? And Susan was also great and also very kind, but just said, can you bring emotion in? Can you be more descriptive? And slowly these pieces started turning from travelogue, which I had no idea how to write, to a very personal story about the island, about my experiences in Maine, about growing up in this really beautiful place as a background, but with a lot of hard things. And that, you open that proverbial vein on the page, and to me, then there was something to continue to refine, to continue to try and change. And every single one of these essays that found its way into this book started as something, the Disoriented, which is about working in a nursing home and running the carriage path, started as something about like pick up basketball at the Y and on to other things. So again, there was a lot of like, you need to be able to change your mind and think in real time with the current piece, and what is this piece demanding? And a lot of times it wasn't what I thought it demanded. So I'm just gonna start with, I actually have a few short readings. This first one is about, I thought my mom was gonna sell her house. And so I actually went and visited it for what I thought was the last time. And then I wrote it sort of thinking about like, if you give a moose a muffin, conditional piece. So this is called, If You Give a Girl an Outhouse. If you offer a 52-year-old woman a last visit to her childhood home in rural Maine before it is sold, she will say no, I think not. She will remember a dirt road of potholes to get to the house and deer flies that chased her on a long walk home from the school bus stop, a house without electricity or even for a time indoor plumbing, a house without siblings, without wall-to-wall carpeting and televisions and all the conveniences of her friends' houses in town. She will remember isolation and powerlessness and boredom. She will remember a childhood of wants and needs not met. But if she walks inside the house, light-drenched from the white-painted wood of the walls and ceilings, she'll want to slowly wander and pick up every piece of art that clutters the shelves and windowsills. Nesting Russian dolls, wooden elephants and foxes, dioramas her mother made from cardboard. The tiny, intricate scenes will be of mothers and children's hanging clothes and stacking wood and shoveling snow. Next slide. And she will see the photographs everywhere, crowding the wooden stairs as they wind to the second floor, the kitchen, the bathroom. An infant bathing in a white enamel tub on a sunny kitchen floor of an old farmhouse. A naked toddler, belly round, sitting in a field in front of a guitar case cluttered with picnic food. A little girl alone in the waves with an armful of seaweed. Was that me? She will think. She will notice that she did not look unhappy in any of these photos. If there's someone in the indoor bathroom that was built after she left for college, she'll want to use the outhouse at the end of the stone steps that lead deep in the woods. She'll notice the inside of the outhouse painted sky blue with wooden gold stars nailed to the ceiling, New Yorker cartoons stapled to the wall, the squirrel holding an acorn saying nutty, yet with a hint of oak, her favorite, and the gentle wind that blows through the screen door so that it doesn't even smell that bad. Then she'll want to sit on the screened-in porch, watching the tree shadows flicker across the floor, and that will remind her of her cousins visiting from Soamesville and an evening dinner with salad greens, tomatoes, and dill, straight from the garden in front of the house. the garden encased by a stone wall built by her parents when they were young and dreaming together. She remembered the hermit thrushes trilling outside, a long whistle, then crystals tinkling like a chandelier. And if you show her all the bookshelves stuffed with paperbacks, this will remind her how she loved the unbearable lightness of being and a prayer for Owen Meany and all the other treasures she found on board afternoons in this sun-washed house. If she sees the boardwalk behind the garden, she'll want to follow it around back where the solar panels lean, an anachronism to this shingled house with its hand water pump in the front yard. And if she walks the whole way around the house to the granite ledge, she'll catch sight of a giant rusted fish hanging on the wooden shingles, at least 6 feet long with sharp-looking gills welded by a friend of her father's. Next slide. She'll also see the sculpture of a little girl kneeling, her neck arched to the sky on a pedestal of concrete, and the driftwood crane nailed to the side of the house. And she'll want to lie on the boardwalk and pick the blueberries that grow along the lichen-covered granite. And she'll remember she was surrounded by artists and dreamers. And she will understand some of the reasons her mother chose this life. And she'll feel the art and beauty and sadness that this house taught her, and it will bring her peace. Can't think of that peace. And next line. So my next reading is about Katahdin, where we went with our Quaker meeting every year, this big trip. And again, this piece started out like, I think 20 pages about the 100 miles of wilderness. My husband and I did kind of tie in with this and tried to do 5 different trips and then and talk about the geology of the place. And then I slowly kind of honed it down to a much more personal story about going to this mountain. Am I still doing okay on time, are we? Yeah. Oh yeah, we're fine, okay. Katahdin. I awoke curled in my sleeping bag to the smell of pine trees, leaf litter, and pancakes. Things were happening around me while I hurriedly pulled on my blue Dickies pants inside my bag and smoothed my worn sweater. 5th grade had started a few weeks before, and I'd learned some hard truths. A, I was not popular, and popularity seemed a distant land, unobtainable with no path to lead me there. A cool older brother, maybe one who played basketball and had his own car, or a tough, loudmouth sister who took no crap would have helped, but I had neither. And without siblings, I hadn't been schooled in the fine art of banter, or being teased. B, I didn't have the right clothes. In 4th grade, nobody seemed to care what clothes you wore, but in 5th grade, everybody did. The edicts were specific and expensive. So I saved my babysitting money for an Ocean Pacific shirt or a Lacoste belt that might help me fit in. C, my brown, thick hair was all wrong. I need to grow out the bangs that framed my wide, freckled face and made me look like an 8-year-old, but my mom insisted that I wear a bandana to keep the hair out of my eyes. Bandana, really, in 1980? D, I didn't know how to swear and make it sound good. E, I wasn't pretty enough for flaws A through D to be forgiven. The darkness of the lean-to outlined the scene in a picture frame. Parents from our Quaker meeting, Bar Harbor chapter, huddled around a propane-fueled coffee pot in sweaters and coats. A few kids were already up, sitting on rocks and eating breakfast, enamel plates balanced on their knees. Behind them all, a mountain of bare rock peeked through the trees. I searched for my mom and found her long, dark ponytail escaping a black knitted hat, steaming coffee in hand. She was much younger than the other moms and the only single parent in the group. She looked happy talking to Carol, Amy and Laura's mom, and that put my mind at ease. The good thing was that we weren't at school, and with only 8 kids on this hiking trip, no one could afford to be choosy. Amy was a year older, with long, wavy hair, and she was already showing curves I longed for. We didn't hang out at school, but we formed an alliance for these Quaker get-togethers. I envied her blithe confidence. She said whatever was on her mind. We sat on the rocks with her sister Laura and Laura's best friend Cynthia, who were in 7th grade and had the benevolence that came with their higher rank. Katahdin is the first place to see the sunrise in the whole country, Bill, Amy's dad, said. Are we going to be the first ones today? Amy asked him. No, we have to be up on top of the mountain at sunrise, and we can't climb in the dark, her dad said. I liked the idea. It sounded like a cool thing to see the sun before everyone else. I heard someone falls off the knife edge and dies every year, a 12-year-old boy named David said with a smile. That's only if you do something foolish, like get off the path, Carol said. But I felt a twinge of fear. Was this something our Quaker meeting group did, risk our lives on lethal hiking trails? After breakfast, we headed down to the shore of Chimney Pond. It sat in the center of a circle of mountain peaks, like a cauldron stirred by a coven of towering witches. Half the circle was cast in shadow, and the other half was all exposed rock, lit by the fierce morning sun. It was a heady sight. It was also disquieting. How could I be in this one place, depression at the center of the mountain, and yet in a few short hours I'd be looking down from those peaks? And then by late afternoon, I'd be right back on the edge of this pond. In math class, I was learning about vectors and how if you travel the same distance in opposite directions, you'd arrive back at your starting point. Still, it didn't seem possible to accomplish such a feat in one day on Katahdin. We split into groups by trail. I was excited to have graduated from the saddle trail, a landslide of rock and sand we'd done the year before, to Cathedral, a shorter but more difficult ascent. 9 of us, 6 kids and 3 adults, started out, backpacks weighted with water and peanut butter sandwiches. The trail was a pretty easy walk at first through the spruce and pine trees behind the ranger station, until suddenly we came to a boulder field with blue paint blazes leading us straight up. Why are all these rocks together? Did they just fall off the mountain? Asked Cynthia. A glacier left them, said Melba, Cynthia's mom. I imagined flying high above the earth and witnessing this massive ball of ice, snow, and rock as it slid across the land like a giant snail, leaving trails of truck-sized boulders in its wake. Melba had short, curly hair, big glasses, and a floaty serenity of someone whose mind was happily elsewhere. She laughed a lot and never seemed to judge or correct us. I liked being around her. We had left the forest. Now there were just a few miniature fir trees with gnarled, bent branches that defiantly sprouted through the granite rock piles, extending as far ahead as we could see. At first, the climbing was absurdly fun. I pulled myself up by stuffing my fingers into lichen-covered crevices and digging my sneakers into the boulder's sides. But after an hour, my legs and arms ached with the effort. Still, it was thrilling to be just one of the pack, a parade of us winding through the rocks. I felt blissfully unseen. Instead of the attention and scrutiny that came with being an only child, I was just one of you kids, as in, you kids ready for a snack, or you kids see the moose on the pond? Because we climbed on the edge of the bowl, we could see our progress exactly. Soon, Chimney Pond had become a tiny puddle glimmering in the shadow of the mountain. But some of the boulders became too big and steep to climb, and I needed a boost. Do you see the second cathedral? Melba asked me as she motioned for me to step on her encircled hands. Above us, I could see a big stony outcropping. Isn't that the top? I asked her, hand on her shoulder while I stepped up. No, we're getting there, but that's a false peak, one of the cathedrals. Don't they look like they were made by aliens? Each cathedral was a tower of granite that did look mysteriously intentional. I could only nod in agreement. Amy and I climbed onto the second cathedral, talking about Mr. Shapazian, the strictest and scariest teacher at Emerson Connors Middle School. But we stopped talking as soon as we took in the view of the jagged knife edge. It looked close enough that we could touch it. I stood on the mound of rocks and felt the cooler air of the higher altitude evaporate the sweat on my neck. The sounds inside the bowl collected and floated up in the swirling wind, the squawks of crows playing in the air currents, a moose bellowing below, scattered conversations from far away. Amy and I smiled at each other, recognizing this moment of shared awe. And on we hiked and crawled from false peak to false peak. Finally, we crested the top of the boulder field, where we ran into the saddle trail on its concluding stretch to the summit. It was far less steep, just a ridge of small stone with no vegetation. It looked like a walk on the moon. An enormous pile of rocks and a brown A-frame sign told us we'd arrived at the top, Baxter Peak, elevation 5,267 feet. Carol took a picture of us with the sign, and then we all sat among the spotted green granite while she fished out a bag of trail mix and passed it around. From this high up, I could see it wasn't just this horseshoe of mountains, but a chain of them leading north, with silver lakes dotting the landscape in the September sun. Here in northern Maine, the foliage was already turning, and mounds of yellow and orange could be seen among the evergreens. I leaned back on my hands and rolled a peanut M&M around in my mouth, the wind whipping my hair in a stream in front of me. The chocolate nuttiness was divine, but it wasn't the taste that made my chest bubble and sing. What was that feeling? It was incredible. I laid back on the rocks and the words just tumbled out, talking to no one and everyone. That was amazing. I love M&Ms. That is the coolest hike I've ever done. This is the most beautiful place in the world. Everyone was looking at me a little strangely. Why was I talking so much? There it was, a feeling of deep joy and simultaneously a loss of self-consciousness. I felt separated from myself with a euphoria that felt sublime. I didn't care about my clothes or hair or lack of curves. I wasn't just one of the kids. I was insignificant, a drop of water in the ocean, a molecule of air in the sky, a speck on a mountain. And I knew I desperately wanted to feel it again and again, this exhilaration and exhaustion and forgotten self, my own religion. We turned our eyes to Knife Edge, and any anxiety I had before about that narrow, exposed trail was gone. We picked up our backpacks and hiked among the clouds. Next slide. And finally, I just thought I'd end with just like a short local one about Northeast Harbor, since we're here. And this is just a moment of just joy with my husband that again was kind of, had been taken down and down from pages to just a couple paragraphs. Next slide. Little Long Pond Skate. It is the day after Christmas, and the mood is still unhurried, with a slow morning of coffee and pumpkin cake. After we put the dishes away, a trip outside is the only item on the day's agenda. Kevin and I park at Bracy Cove, a sheltered inlet outside Northeast Harbor with a cobbled beach surrounded by towering pines. A flotilla of buffleheads, stout little black and white sea ducks, dive and bob off the shoreline. We wander the beach and collect handfuls of the speckled granite rocks, worn to smooth Easter eggs of delicate salmon pink and gray-green. They feel perfectly weighted in our mittened hands. After we've left our favorites in a pile on the beach, we hike inland to Little Long Pond, our skates nestled on our shoulders. We stop at the boathouse, marveling that the ice has enveloped the perimeter of the wooden boat launch. The building is not so much surrounded by ice as seems to erupt from it, like it grew from organized molecules of frozen water. We lace our skates on the porch, then cling to the banister and inch out onto the ice. Those first few steps are hesitant and frightening, but from toddler to child in a few strides, I'm teetering, then gliding. The sky and its reflection in the ice are both a blinding blue. I'm worried I'll trip if I can't see all the cracks, but you grab my hand and we fly. So that's sort of how this book and essays came together, and it was really the most terrifying thing I've ever done, but also one of the more satisfying. There's a woodblock print. This is kind of the final one of, if you've read the book, there's a Four River print in the book. It's about my dad's accident, and it just takes you through all the stages of it, and you're welcome to touch his plate if you'd like. It's been through a lot more than touches. And I'd love to take any questions now if anyone has any.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you print many of your?
Yeah, I print 6. I edition, so each print is usually about, has an edition of 6 of them total of the originals. And that's just because editioning is really tedious. And so if you have a studio assistant and someone who's gonna print you hundreds, that's one thing, but I just print on my own. So 6 seems like a good number.
So does that mean that you do 6 of one color?
Exactly.
And then you come back?
Exactly. And you know, the way I think about it is I actually I take the print and I tack it right up on the board, and as I'm carving, I say, what do I want to stay this color? Because again, that sort of slows that decision-making process down where you just are thinking about one color and nothing else, because you don't have to think about the next color you're gonna print. All you have to think about is what's gonna stay that one color. So it really is a nice way to take a very complicated printmaking and actually method and make it slow, you know, and just think about one color at a time. And I've seen some beautiful ones done actually even just with 2 colors, like blue and black, or you know, they're you know, the white of the paper, and then you know, a middle tone and a dark tone. But I feel like 6 is the right, you know, and then they have to dry, and it's oil-based ink, so usually a color or 2 a day, and that's about all, and then it needs to sit. So these usually take in them, I would say, you know, 1 to 2 months a piece, depending on, you know, how big, because obviously every inch of wood adds like exponentially more carving. So.
Is it in an art gallery in town here, or where?
I'm out of Portland, so Portland. Yeah, so I have a studio in Portland where I show prints. So,
oh, okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
I was just wondering if you have done any book illustrations for children's books.
Well, I did do, Island Port Press had approached me about doing Robert Tristram Coffin's Christmas in Maine, which had been printed, I think, in like the 20s, and then they were doing another version of it. So I did do that. That was my sort of one and done for illustrations, though, because it's, it was 2 years of making blocks, and blocks take a long time, it's just, and I feel like more and more, I mean, because it's an older art form, I see much, for children's books more, I see much more like computer-generated art now for children's books than I do for, my best friend from high school is a writer, and she wrote me actually like a beautiful, text to try and sell with illustrations, and they're like, oh, we really want, computer-generated illustrations, so, and that was okay, because actually that in some ways led to this book, because I found that I really like that back and forth between, the cross-pollination of writing something and then saying, okay, now I want to make an illustration for that. And it was about, I had a lot of these already done, obviously, for the calendar, but a lot of them were made for the book, of just that feeling, that, that moment that, I mean, a lot of pieces it was easy because I was writing about something that had happened, and I made that, that would years ago, just in thinking about that moment. So anyway, but it was a nice back and forth, and I've been sort of percolating that, how do you start again, and what's the subject matter, but not quite there yet. So, Roberta?
Continue to write. I don't know how you have time to do all this.
In fits and starts, I'm sort of toying with a recipe, like essays with recipes, like kind of, because I'm also like an avid cook, so I thought it might be fun to like try, kind of like recipes for, hope and despair sort of thing, what I mean, like kind of different, different moments that you make different foods. I thought might be an interesting one to illustrate, but it is amazing how quickly I think you get in practice and out of practice with writing, as with everything, but it just blows me away on the writing, because after 6 months of writing 3 or 4 times a week, words just came much more quickly. I couldn't believe it, even at work, I was like, I should be doing this just for brain health, because it's so important, I find, as I've gotten older, that you lose words much more quickly, and this was really, when you're working in language for an hour or 2 a day, it makes a huge difference in how your brain works. So I highly recommend it. Sorry, I have one more, yes. Hi, Steve.
First one is that I love your presentation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I really enjoyed the way you took us through the process. But I have a question.
Yes.
You showed us how you draw and then reverse
Yes.
the drawing so that it looks the way you want and it's printed. But what you didn't show is a colored version of the image that you're trying to.
That's because I don't make one.
That's what I want to know. Are you envisioning that whole thing in your mind?
Well, I think because there's too many variables, and this is, again, I don't know if I mean, it's a hard subject matter, I guess, to encompass all things, but that uncertainty to me very much plays into woodblock printmaking as well, because there are too many variables to plan from the beginning how every color is going to interact with one another. I think it would be impossible. I work at a Peregrine Press, which is a co-op in Portland, and everyone's a professional printmaker, and it's really interesting to see all their work, but some people will test colors, like they just have, just sheets and sheets and sheets where they're just testing color. And my hat's off to them, but there's no way I could do that, because first of all, I don't know if I have the brain for it, but also just because those colors change so much as you layer different colors on top of them. So to me, I feel like I need to react to the current conditions, what is the color now? And obviously, I have an idea. I would say with this piece, I absolutely had a color drawing of it, painting of it. But with most of them, I have an idea, and then I just start in, and it's one color at a time, one set of decisions at a time.
Finding.
Yeah, finding, exactly, finding, and it's such satisfying work, because it really is all about decision making, and it keeps your brain engaged. And for me, it is absolutely the same way as medicine is, it's wonderful to have a diagnosis, know exactly what you want to do, but, it stops your curiosity. It stops you from continuing to kind of quest for information and really, think in real time. So. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm happy to sign books if anyone has one they want signed. I'll just stand right up here, and again, feel free to.